Hi there and welcome back to Dreamoria. Tonight, I want to tell you the entire story of the Druids. The simple reason is that they are one of those groups from the ancient world who feel both real and kind of unreal at the same time. You hear the word Druid, and you instantly think of forests, rituals, secret knowledge, and people who seem to understand nature in a way the rest of us forgot. The Druids sit at a wonderful crossroads between history and enchantment. I am going to walk you through where they lived, what they were believed to do, why they mattered so much to Celtic society, and how their legend kept growing even after their world started to change. If you enjoy these kinds of stories, please like and subscribe. It really is the best way to support the channel, and it helps these long wandering journeys find the people who need them. And if you feel like it, tell me, where in the world are you listening from? Thank you for being here. Now, get comfy. This one is going to be a good ride. There is a funny thing about the Druids that happens almost immediately when you start looking for them. They are everywhere and nowhere at the same time. You can walk into any bookstore and find them in fantasy sections, in spiritual shelves, in glossy books about ancient secrets, and in the kind of tourist shops that sell you a little bag of mist and promise it is real Irish fog. But the real Druids, the ones who lived and breathed in the old Celtic world, left us no personal diaries, no neat lists of rules, no glamorous "this is the way we do it" handbook. So we stand at the edge of their world the way someone might stand at the edge of a forest at night, hearing movement inside, but never quite seeing what made the sound. To understand how they could become so powerful in legend while remaining so elusive in detail, you have to step into the Celtic world itself, because the Druids did not float above society like mysterious smoke. They were woven into it. The Celts were not one single empire marching under one flag. They were a wide family of tribes spread across a huge part of Europe. They lived in Britain and Ireland, across Gaul, in parts of Spain and Central Europe, and even as far into the Eastern world as Anatolia, where the Galatians settled and caused enough trouble to be remembered by name. This was a world of hill forts, long trade routes, shifting alliances, and a rich culture of art, metalwork, song, and story. It was a world that valued courage, reputation, hospitality, and a kind of poetic memory that could keep generations alive just by speaking their names. If you are trying to imagine the atmosphere, think of a society where the past is not a dusty shelf, but an active presence that can be summoned by the right words at the right time. In that setting, an educated class was not a luxury, but a pillar. Someone had to remember the laws, keep the peace between clans, preserve sacred traditions, and explain the meaning of the sky, the seasons, the storms, the sudden deaths, and the unexpected good fortune that could appear like a gift or a warning. The Druids fit that need so perfectly that the role seems almost inevitable once you picture the world clearly. They were not only religious figures, they were also teachers, judges, advisors to kings, and guardians of tradition. Their authority did not come from castles or armies. It came from knowledge, and from the belief that knowledge itself was a form of power. When a society accepts that certain people have access to the rules of the universe, you get something stronger than fear. You get trust. You get reverence. You get a sense that the Druids might be the ones who keep the invisible machinery of life running smoothly. Even the name feels like it carries the smell of leaves after rain. Many people connect the word Druid to the oak, and the image is so persuasive it is hard not to love it. The oak was one of the great kings of the forest in Celtic thought. It was strong, long-lived, and generous with shade and shelter. It was also a practical tree for a world that built, heated, cooked, and crafted with wood. But the oak also had the sort of symbolic weight that makes a tree turn into an idea. A person who knew the oak, who understood the grove, who could speak of the forest as a place of meaning and not just resources, would have seemed like a person who understood life itself. When later sources describe Druids gathering in groves or treating certain trees as sacred, it does not feel like a decorative detail. It feels like a central clue to the way they saw the world. The problem, or the delight depending on your mood, is that nearly everything we hear about them comes from outsiders. Greek and Roman writers looked at the Druids with fascination, admiration, and sometimes alarm. Julius Caesar is the most famous of these voices because he was not just a casual observer. He was a man trying to conquer the world the Druids belonged to. When he wrote about them during his campaigns in Gaul in the 1st century BCE, he described an organized and influential priestly class. He tells us they handled sacrifices and religious matters, that they were deeply involved in law and disputes, and that they taught young men for years. He also claims that the soul was immortal and moved from body to body, a belief that would have been both comforting and motivating in a warrior culture. You can imagine how useful such a belief might be when you are asking someone to face a Roman legion without flinching. Caesar also says something that has sparked centuries of imagination. He suggests that Britain was a major center of Druid learning and that those who wanted the deepest training traveled there. Whether that is literal truth or a Roman impression of British prestige, it adds a wonderful sense of scale. It implies a network of learning across the sea. It suggests that Druidic instruction may have been something like attending a renowned school, where going to the right place could shape your status for life. If you let the image breathe for a moment, you can see a young student leaving home, crossing rough waters, and arriving in a land of forests and old sanctuaries, eager to learn the rules of the sacred world the way others might learn the rules of politics or war. And the training itself is one of the most impressive ideas in the whole story. The Druids, like the bards, lived in a culture where memory was a craft. They famously did not commit their teachings to writing. This was not because they could not write, since writing existed all around them. It was because oral knowledge carried a special authority. When something is memorized and passed from a teacher to a student, it becomes alive in the act of speaking. It becomes part of the person who holds it, and it becomes harder for the casual outsider to steal. Roman sources suggest that Druidic study could take many years, even as long as 20. That is a long time to sit with elders, learn poetry and law, absorb genealogies, mythic narratives, sacred formulas, observations of the stars, and the vast catalogue of plants and their uses. It is also long enough to turn learning into identity. You are not merely someone who knows a fact. You become someone who belongs to a lineage of knowledge. It also helps explain why the Druids could occupy a place that was both spiritual and political. In societies without a centralized bureaucracy, the people who control knowledge control the social glue that holds everything together. A Druid who could settle a blood feud, interpret a bad omen, or confirm the legitimacy of a king was not a side character. He was a crucial mechanism of order. When Roman writers mention that Druids could impose severe religious penalties, including exclusion from rituals, it sounds like a spiritual punishment, but it was also a social one. In a culture where community and ritual were intertwined, being cut off was almost like being erased. If you are looking for soft power in the ancient world, this is it. But it would be a mistake to imagine them only as stern judges and solemn priests. The Celtic world loved story, poetry, and reputation, and Druids would have moved through that world as highly educated figures who understood how to speak in ways that carried weight. Their authority likely came with performance, with ceremony, with the careful use of language. In a society where words could be binding, where satire could ruin a man's standing, and where praise poetry could elevate a chieftain to near mythic status. The people who mastered language held a special kind of influence. A Druid might have been as comfortable at a public assembly as in a quiet grove, because both places required the same skill. Reading the room, reading the signs, reading the story of who the people believed themselves to be. There is also the bigger question that hangs over all of this, the one that makes the Druids so irresistible. Where did they begin? The earliest written references to Druids from the Mediterranean world show us that by the time Greeks and Romans noticed them, they were already established and respected. That suggests a long development behind the scenes. Druidism likely grew out of older Indo-European religious patterns and local Celtic traditions shaped by centuries of social change. The Druids may have inherited practices from even earlier sacred specialists, then refined them into a formal class. By the time the Iron Age was in full swing, the Celts were not only building fortresses and trading goods, they were building ideas about identity, ancestry, and the relationship between humanity and the living world. Druids would have been at the center of that, not as inventors of religion from scratch, but as professional guardians of a worldview that already ran deep. This is where the mythic glow begins to form, because when you have a class of people who do not write their secrets down, who train for years in memorized wisdom, who link law, ritual, and cosmology into one role, and who meet in places that feel set apart from ordinary life, you get a natural aura. The sacred grove is not just a location, it is a symbol of another way of thinking. It is the idea that knowledge can be rooted in nature, that the forest itself can be a classroom, and that the gods might prefer leaf and sky over stone temples. Whether the Druids were literally always in the woods is less important than the idea that they belonged to the woods, that their authority was not separated from the natural world, but derived from it. If you imagine a day in that early Druidic world, you can almost see how they fit into the rhythm of life. A chieftain might consult them before a major alliance. A farmer might seek their blessing for a crucial planting. A family might ask for guidance after a troubling dream. A young student might watch an elder recite a genealogy that reaches back through time in a way that makes the old dead ancestors feel present and attentive. And in moments of large public ceremony, when the tribe gathered to honor a seasonal turning or a sacred obligation, the Druids would have given the event its shape and meaning. They were the people who told you why it mattered and why the gods might be listening. And then, of course, there is the moment when the outside world begins to press in. The Romans were not just passing tourists with notebooks. They were the most organized imperial power the Western world had seen. When Rome met the Celtic world, it met not only fierce warriors and dramatic hill forts, but also a spiritual class that could unify people through shared belief and lore. It is easy to see why Roman writers paid such close attention. The Druids were not a quaint local custom. They were a system of influence. The fact that Caesar took the time to describe their role suggests that he understood they were part of what made Celtic society resilient and coherent. So in this first stretch of the story, before any great clash with empire or any dramatic ending of old traditions, we are looking at the Druids in their natural element. They were not yet a memory. They were an active force. They belonged to a world where myth was not an entertainment category, but a way of explaining reality, where the line between nature and sacred meaning was thin enough to step across, where the education of a single person could take decades, because that education was meant to shape the whole community. The Druids make more sense when you think of them not as isolated mystics, but as the brain and conscience of a society that believed knowledge should be carried by human beings, spoken in human voices, and protected by tradition. When you stand at the edge of that world, you can feel why their legend has lasted. People love the idea that there were once teachers who learned in forests, who carried law in their minds, who could speak of the soul without fear of death, and who treated the living earth as a sacred partner rather than a silent resource. Whether you meet them through Roman reports, later Celtic stories, or the modern imagination, the emotional shape is consistent. The Druids represent a kind of lost confidence in meaning, the comforting thought that the world was readable, that signs could be understood, and that wisdom had a place at the center of public life. And as the light shifts toward the next part of their journey, my favorite way to picture it is simple. Imagine a grove at the end of a long day. The air cools. The conversations quiet down. A teacher and a student linger after everyone else has gone, repeating lines of lore or poetry until the words settle into memory. Somewhere beyond the trees, the tribe eats, argues, celebrates, and prepares for the next season. The Druids are present in all of it, not loud, not flashy, just essential. The forest darkens gradually, and the old knowledge remains awake inside human minds. If the first thing that makes the Druids so magnetic is the fog of mystery around them, the second thing is the sheer ambition of what they seem to be trying to do. They were not simply people who performed rituals and spoke to gods in forests. They were also the people who carried the memory of an entire society. That is a bigger job than it sounds. In a world without printing presses, without libraries open to the public, without easy ways to store information beyond the fragile human mind, You needed specialists who could act as walking archives. The Druids appear to have been exactly that. When Roman writers describe them, it is rarely with the tone of casual interest. It reads more like someone stumbling into a system that is already carefully built and running at impressive speed. So to understand them in a way that feels human, it helps to imagine less of a mysterious sorcerer and more of an elite educator, a judge, a philosopher, and a cultural anchor who just happened to do his most important work under trees instead of under marble columns. The training alone could make you sit up straighter. Ancient sources claim that becoming a druid required a long period of study, sometimes said to be up to 20 years. Even if we take that as a rounded number meant to impress the reader, the core message is still clear. This was not weekend schooling, it was a life shape. A young person entering druidic training was effectively choosing to become part of a specialized class with responsibilities that touched religion, law, story, diplomacy, and social cohesion. The idea that you might spend the bulk of your youth learning sacred formulas, tribal lore, genealogies, rituals, astronomy, poetry, and the medicinal uses of plants tells you that the Druids were not improvising. They were not casual mystics who woke up one day and decided to read the clouds for a living. They were part of a structured system of knowledge with standards, expectations, and a clear social purpose. It is also one of the most beautiful details that they preferred to teach orally. We should not imagine that the Celts were incapable of writing. Writing existed across the ancient world, and the Celts had contact with literate cultures through trade and warfare. But oral tradition was not about ability, it was about values. When knowledge is written down, it becomes a thing you can carry away. When knowledge is taught by memory, it becomes a relationship. It ties the student to the teacher, and the teacher to a line of tradition that reaches back through time. It also makes learning an act of endurance and loyalty. You prove you are worthy of the material by the effort it takes to hold it inside you. In that sense, refusing to write sacred teachings was not stubbornness. It was a form of protection and a way of making wisdom feel alive. Imagine a young student, perhaps the child of a noble family, arriving at a place where learning happens in open air. We do not have a schedule or a curriculum in the modern sense, so we have to infer the shape from what outsiders recorded and from the logic of the society itself. But it is easy to picture a routine that blends the practical and the sacred. Morning lessons might involve law. Elders recite rulings and precedents, cases of land disputes, blood feuds, compensation, and the obligations between clans. In a culture where honor and justice were deeply public matters, knowing the law was not a quiet academic skill. It was a way to prevent entire communities from tearing themselves apart. Later in the day, teaching might turn to poetry and memory. A student learns how to recite lineages of kings and heroes, how to preserve the names of the dead, how to speak in a way that carries weight during public gatherings. And somewhere within all of that, the sacred world is always present, not separated into a distinct subject, but woven into everything. The gods, the spirits of the land, the rhythm of seasons, and the meaning of animals and natural signs are not add-ons, they are the frame. The Druids were not the only learned class in the Celtic world, and this is another detail that makes them feel more real. Bards and poets served a parallel function, preserving story and reputation. In many ways, the Druids and bards were cousins in the same cultural family, each specializing in different forms of authority. The bard could praise a leader into near myth and could reduce a reputation to ash with satire. The druid could validate a king's legitimacy, mediate disputes, and align the life of the tribe with the sacred order of the universe. In a society where memory was currency, these roles overlapped and reinforced each other. Together they formed a kind of cultural nervous system. If you remove them, the body of society still exists, but it loses its ability to coordinate itself with the same grace. Roman writers mention that Druids were often exempt from military service and taxes. That sounds like a perk, and it certainly was, but it also suggests something deeper. Exemption is not given lightly in a warrior society. It implies that the Druids were considered too important to be lost in battle or distracted by mundane obligations. Their value was in what they knew and what they could do for the spiritual and legal health of the community. It also hints at how their neutrality might have been preserved. A judge who must arbitrate between clans cannot easily belong to a single warband. A spiritual authority who regulates rituals needs the trust of the whole tribe, not just the faction that holds the sharpest swords. Their public role as judges is worth lingering over because it is one of the ways we can most clearly see them operating in everyday life. When two families disputed a boundary, or when a killing demanded compensation or revenge, the Druids could step in as the ones who knew the right forms, the right precedents, the right balance between justice and peace. Caesar tells us that they judged nearly all public and private disputes. That is a sweeping claim, and perhaps the reality varied by region, but it still paints a picture of a class that could regulate social tension. In a sense, the Druids were not merely keepers of religion, they were keepers of order. This ties to one of the more striking punishments attributed to them. To be excluded from sacrifice and ritual was considered the harshest penalty. In modern terms, it is hard to imagine being banned from a ceremony as worse than fines or imprisonment. But in an ancient community where ritual was a key way of belonging, to be cut off was to be morally and socially isolated. It was like being expelled from the story your people tell about themselves. There is something both austere and strangely elegant about a society that treats spiritual exclusion as the ultimate consequence, because it reveals how deeply religion and social identity were fused. The Druids also appear to have been advisors to kings and chieftains. This is the point where we can imagine a very human dynamic. Power in the Celtic world was personal. It rested in leaders who managed alliances, raided enemies, distributed gifts, and maintained honor. Those leaders needed counselors who could speak not only about politics, but about legitimacy, taboo, and the right timing for major decisions. When should a campaign begin? When should an oath be sworn? Who is truly worthy of leading the tribe? These are questions that have practical consequences, but in a pagan society, they are also religious ones. A Druid who confirms that a decision aligns with sacred law is strengthening the ruler's authority in the eyes of everyone who believes the gods pay attention to human affairs. And then there is the famous mention of belief in reincarnation, or at least the immortality of the soul. Roman writers tell us that the Druids taught that the soul does not die, but passes into another body. Again, we cannot know exactly how this was understood in every place and time, but the idea is consistent with the broader Celtic sense that the boundary between this world and the other world was permeable. This belief also has obvious social effects. If you expect life to continue in another form, the fear of death changes shape. Courage becomes easier to cultivate. Loss feels different. And the universe itself feels less like a straight line and more like a cycle, which fits a religion so deeply connected to seasons and natural rhythms. As you sit with these details, the image of Druid education becomes even more impressive. A student was not just memorizing facts. He was absorbing a worldview that linked cosmic cycles, moral law, communal identity, and personal destiny into a single coherent system. That is the kind of learning that produces quiet confidence. And it may help explain why the Druids appeared so formidable to Roman observers. Rome was used to priesthoods, yes, but the Roman religious system was often more transactional and civic in style. The Druids, by contrast, seem to represent a more holistic role, the sort of figure who could be a philosopher one day, a lawgiver the next, and a ritual leader the next. The same person who interprets an omen can also settle a land dispute and educate the next generation. That is an extraordinary concentration of authority. There is also the matter of place. The Druids are consistently associated with natural settings. Groves, rivers, hills, and islands appear as sacred landscapes. Whether every lesson took place outdoors is beside the point. The important thing is that their identity was tied to the living world. The classroom was not a building, it was a relationship with nature. This makes their learning feel less like abstract theory and more like listening to the environment as a teacher, knowing which plants heal and which harm, understanding which birds or animals symbolically connect with particular deities, tracking seasonal transitions, reading the sky, learning to recognize the quiet patterns that can guide a community in practical and spiritual ways. Think of the medicinal knowledge alone. A Druid who knew the properties of herbs could be a healer in a time when illness could collapse a household's future. The line between medicine and magic was not sharp. To gather a plant at the right phase of the moon or with the right ritual words could be both a spiritual act and a practical one. These were not separate domains. The belief that nature was enchanted was not a metaphor. It was a working assumption. In that worldview, a healer is also a spiritual technician. A plant is both chemistry and sacred gift. We might not describe it that way now, but for the Celts, it was perfectly coherent. This is where the Druids begin to feel not only powerful, but oddly familiar. Every society creates specialists who do the jobs that hold the larger system together. We have judges, professors, doctors, historians, and religious leaders. The Druids seem to compress many of those roles into one institution. So, if you want to imagine what it might have felt like to encounter a Druid in daily life, you do not need to leap into fantasy immediately. You can imagine the Druid as the person everyone respects because he knows how things should be done and why they matter. The one who can recite the old agreements between clans. The one who remembers what happened 3 generations ago when 2 families nearly went to war. The one who knows the story of a sacred river and the taboo that cannot be broken without inviting misfortune. This is not theatrical magic, it is social magic. The mystical aura is still there, of course, and part of what makes the Druid world so compelling is that it is not ashamed of mystery. The Celts were life-loving and war-ready and deeply poetic. They did not keep the supernatural at arm's length. They built it into the texture of ordinary life, so a Druid could walk through a settlement and be approached not only for legal matters, but for spiritual ones. A troubling dream, a strange animal sighting, a string of unusually harsh storms, a child born under a certain sign. The Druid would have been someone who could translate these events into meaning. In modern terms, we call that interpretation. In ancient terms, it might have been the difference between calm and panic. Some of this influence would also have been reinforced by ceremony. We can easily imagine communal gatherings where the Druids presided over rituals tied to seasonal festivals. The turning points of the year were more than agricultural markers. They were sacred thresholds, fires lit at key moments, offerings made to secure fertility and peace. These gatherings were social glue and religious affirmation at once. Leading them required confidence, knowledge, and the ability to project authority without relying on physical force. That is a rare skill in any era. It is worth remembering, too, that the Druids were part of a world that loved spectacle when it mattered. Celtic art and metalwork show a people with a taste for intricate beauty and symbolic ornamentation. A ritual space might be simple in materials but rich in meaning. The presence of elders reciting sacred formulas or invoking the gods would have been enough to change the atmosphere of an entire crowd. Religion in such a setting is not a private affair. It is communal theatre with real consequences. When Caesar describes Druidic teaching, he also emphasizes that students learned about the size of the earth, the movements of celestial bodies, and the nature of the cosmos. That is striking because it suggests a curiosity that goes beyond immediate ritual needs. The Druids were not only repeating inherited formulas, they were thinking, studying patterns, making sense of the universe. In that sense, they belong to a tradition of ancient philosophers as much as priests. Their knowledge likely included observations of the sun and moon necessary for calendar keeping, knowing when to plant and harvest, when to hold festivals, when to expect certain seasonal shifts. This is the kind of practical astronomy that grounded spiritual authority in everyday benefits. At this point, it becomes easier to see why Druids were described as an elite class rather than a fringe group. The society needed them. Their training produced people who could help stabilize communities, shape identity, ensure ritual continuity, and preserve knowledge in a world where memory was the safest vault. They were the human infrastructure of culture. When you compress that much responsibility into a single institution, you also create a class whose removal would feel like ripping out the roots of a tree. There is a poignant side to this too. Imagine the psychological weight of being trained for 20 years to hold the memory of your people, to memorize laws and stories and genealogies so thoroughly that you become the living reference point for others. That is a kind of mental architecture that modern education rarely asks of us. It would have required discipline, stamina, and a deep sense of purpose. It also implies that teachers were extraordinarily respected. Knowledge cannot be transmitted at that scale without a culture that honors learning. This is why the Druids resist simple stereotypes. They were not just forest mystics. They were not just priests. They were a class of professionals in a world where professionalism looked different but functioned in recognizable ways. Their authority was spiritual, legal, educational, and cultural. Their classrooms were sacred spaces. Their exams were likely public performance and memorization. Their diplomas were reputation, trust, and the right to speak with the voice of tradition. And all of this took place in a tense and changing world. The Celtic tribes were not isolated. They traded with the Mediterranean. They fought among themselves and against expanding powers. They built wealth, minted coins, and developed complex social hierarchies. As that world grew more connected and more pressured by the rising tide of Rome, the Druids would have been the ones tasked with explaining what change meant, what could be adopted, what must remain sacred, and how to preserve identity when the horizon keeps filling with unfamiliar banners. So when we picture the Druids as teachers and guardians of wisdom, we should picture them not frozen in timeless mist, but moving through a living society that was busy, proud, and anxious about the future in the way all societies are. The Druids were the people who could say, "Here is who we are, and here is how we stay whole." They offered a sense of continuity. They provided the tools for navigating conflict. They linked the tribe to its ancestors and to the invisible world. The day ends again where it began, in a grove or a quiet hall where learning is not rushed. The student repeats a line of law until it sits smoothly on the tongue. The elder corrects the rhythm, the emphasis, the memory of who said what and why it mattered. Somewhere nearby, the evening meal is cooking. Livestock shift in their pens. A child laughs. A dog barks at a shadow. The sacred and ordinary do not compete. They coexist. A Druid's work is not to escape the world, but to keep it intelligible. And as twilight settles across the trees, the great secret of their power feels surprisingly simple. They mattered because they remembered. They mattered because they taught. They mattered because in a universe that could be chaotic and brutal, they offered a map of meaning that people could carry in their hearts. If the Druids were the minds and conscience of the Celtic world, then their religion was the air they breathed. This is the part of the story where the facts and the legends lean close together, like two friends telling the same memory with different details. We know the Druids were religious specialists. We know they performed rites and taught doctrines. And we know they held authority over sacred life, because that is repeated by the outsiders who met them and sometimes feared them. But when we try to picture what their spiritual world felt like from the inside, we have to step into a landscape where nature was not scenery. It was a living partner in every important decision. In such a worldview, a grove is not just a stand of trees. A river is not just water. The wind is not just weather. And an animal crossing your path is not just an animal. Everything can be a message. Everything can be an omen. Everything has a voice if you are trained to listen. The Druids were the people who claimed to understand that language and who could translate it for the rest of the community. There is a reason the image of Druids in forests has such staying power. Even if not every ceremony was held under branches, the idea fits the logic of their religion. Many ancient religions built temples to contain the divine. The Druids appear to have recognized the divine in the world itself. Sacred groves are mentioned repeatedly in the accounts that survive. You can almost feel the social meaning of that choice. A temple built by humans says the gods need a house. A grove says the gods already live here. It is a subtle difference with a huge emotional impact. Standing beneath old oaks, with the ground damp and the air full of leaf scent, you might find it easier to believe that the world is infused with spirit, that the line between human life and cosmic life is thin, and that ceremony does not need walls to be real. The Druids, for all their learned authority, seem to have anchored their work in places that proved their points without a single argument. One of the most famous rituals associated with them is the harvesting of mistletoe from an oak. The story comes to us through Roman and later classical writers who describe a ceremony in which Druids, often pictured in white robes, cut mistletoe with a golden sickle, usually at a carefully chosen time in the lunar cycle. The plant was treated as rare and powerful, a gift of the heavens that had chosen to grow on the king of trees. Whether the details are exact or not, the symbolic meaning is unmistakable. Mistletoe is a plant that seems to appear out of nowhere, suspended between sky and earth, rooted in a tree but not in the ground like other plants. It feels like a natural riddle. For a religion that loved thresholds and liminal places, mistletoe would have been irresistible. It is easy to imagine a community watching this ceremony with the seriousness reserved for things that hold the health of the tribe in their invisible hands, trusting that the right plant gathered in the right way could protect life, restore balance, and keep the gods in a generous mood. The Druids are also linked with animal lore in ways that speak to a broader Celtic fascination with the living world. Celtic art is full of stylized beasts, twisting forms, and creatures that seem to hint at symbolic meaning. The stories that later survive from Irish and Welsh traditions show a world where animals can be messengers, rivals, guides, or transformations of humans and gods. A boar could stand for ferocity and noble danger. A stag could represent wild sovereignty and the pulse of the forest itself. Birds could carry prophecy. A raven might be a grim warning or a sign of divine attention. To people living close to the rhythms of hunting, herding, and seasonal migration, animals were not abstract icons. They were daily facts of life. That made their symbolic power stronger, not weaker. A druid who interpreted an animal sign was not inventing meaning out of thin air. He was drawing on a shared sense that nature and fate were in conversation. This is also the domain where the Druids blur into what we might call magic, though the word can feel clumsy here. For the Celts, healing, ritual, and spiritual authority were not separated into neat categories. A plant used to cure a fever might also be gathered with prayer. An amulet might be both decorative and protective. A chant might be both poetry and spiritual technology. The Druids, trained in memory and nature lore, would have been the ones who knew which roots soothed pain, which leaves treated infection, and which rituals helped align the community with forces too large to see. This is one reason the Druids have endured in imagination as masters of secret knowledge. Their knowledge was secret not because it was showy, but because it was powerful in the quiet way that keeps people alive and reassures them that the world is not random. The calendar of the Celtic world adds another layer to this sacred logic. The great seasonal festivals that later come down to us, especially through Irish tradition, map out a year that is divided by sacred thresholds. Samhain marked the entry into the darker half of the year, a time when the boundaries between worlds were believed to thin. It was a festival of endings and beginnings, of fires, feasts, and the restless nearness of the other world. Beltane celebrated the flourishing of life as spring moved towards summer, often associated with fire rituals and the blessing of livestock and land. Imbolc, linked with the early stirrings of spring and later associated with Brigid in Irish tradition, carried the feeling of light returning in cautious increments. Lugnasad, a harvest celebration connected in later stories with the god Lu, honored the ripening world and the labor that made survival possible. These festivals are not just charming cultural footnotes. They show a society that treated time itself as sacred and that used ritual to make the year feel like a meaningful story rather than a sequence of weather events. It is easy to imagine the Druids at the center of these gatherings, not as entertainers, but as the ones who understood the correct forms, the right prayers, the sacred timing. A society that believed the health of the harvest and the safety of the tribe were influenced by divine favor would have taken these rites seriously. The Druids would have set the tone for communal participation. They would have reminded people of the old stories that explained why Samhain mattered, why fire was a cleanser and protector, why certain nights were more open to spirits and omens. Even if most of the tribe understood the general meaning, the Druid was the one who could articulate it in a way that made everyone feel the weight of tradition pressing kindly on their shoulders. The Druids also appear to have taught ideas about the soul that gave their religion a philosophical depth that impressed Roman observers. The notion that the soul could survive death and perhaps move into another form fits neatly with a worldview that sees life as cyclical. If the year dies into winter and returns in spring, if seeds vanish into earth and rise again as green life, then the idea that human existence might follow an arc that is not final at death feels emotionally consistent. This belief would have done something subtle to the culture. It would have softened the terror of mortality and strengthened the sense that the tribe was part of a bigger rhythm. It would also have given the Druids an even stronger claim to authority, since those who talk with confidence about what happens after death inevitably become the ones people turn to for courage, consolation, and meaning. When outsiders such as Caesar wrote about Druidic sacrifice, They emphasized that the Druids presided over significant rituals, sometimes describing them in dramatic terms. The infamous image of the wicker figure filled with offerings or people exists in the classical record as part of the Roman attempt to explain the severity and power of Celtic religion. Whether one imagines this literally or symbolically, the point within the cultural context is clear. The Romans believed the Druids were capable of mobilizing not only belief, but awe and fear. A religion that requires serious offerings to secure the god's favor suggests that the divine world was treated as an active force in politics and war. It also shows why Rome would later view the Druids as more than local priests. They were a spiritual authority that could unify resistance and provide an ideological spine to tribal identity. But it would be unfair to reduce Druid ritual to the dramatic moments that fascinated Roman writers. Most religious life in any society is not spectacle. It is repetition, blessing, daily observance, small offerings, and the quiet comfort of doing what ancestors did before you. The Druids likely supervised rites of passage, the blessing of agreements, the sacred confirmation of marriages and alliances, and the rituals that describe the relationship between people and land. When a community depends on the health of its fields and herds, a religion that ties prosperity to sacred order becomes a daily presence. A Druid would have been a familiar figure, not an exotic one. The wise presence at a dispute, the counselor before a risky choice, the healer when illness unsettled a household, the interpreter of strange dreams, unexpected storms, or troubling signs in the behavior of animals. In that sense, Druid religion was less a separate sphere and more the underlying grammar of life. This is also where the mythology begins to rise from the ground like mist. Later Celtic stories, even if preserved in Christian-era manuscripts, still echo an older world where sacred specialists can shape fate through speech and ritual. The Irish tales are full of giasa, sacred prohibitions and obligations that feel like the descendants of older spiritual law. The Druids appear in these stories as advisors, prophets, and sometimes rivals of heroes, people who can bless a king or pronounce a doom that becomes inescapable. Even when the later storytellers are writing in a changed world, the memory of Druid power remains intact. It suggests that in the older imagination, the Druid was not merely a background priest. He was a figure who could influence the narrative of a life. So when we consider the Druids as nature's magicians, the most important thing to remember is that their magic was not an escape from reality. It was a way of organizing reality. A sacred grove is a legal and spiritual space. A seasonal festival is an agricultural and cosmic event. A healing ritual is a medical and religious act. The Druids lived at the intersection of these concerns, and that intersection is exactly where a society places the people it trusts most. It is also why their legend is so durable. The modern imagination loves to split the world into rational and mystical, science and spirit, fact and story. The Druids belonged to a culture that did not need that split. They were intelligent and mystical at once, practical and visionary at once, rooted in law and trees and the movement of the stars. As the sun settles lower on this part of the story, I like to picture a late autumn gathering. The air smells of damp earth and smoke. The fields have been cleared and stored. People bring their worries and hopes into a communal space warmed by firelight. A druid stands not as a distant authority, but as a familiar pillar of the tribe, reciting the words that remind everyone that the year is turning as it always has, that darkness is part of the cycle and not the end of the story, that the other world may be close tonight, but that closeness is not only fear, it is also continuity. The ancestors are near, the gods are listening. The living world is folded into a larger rhythm that the Druids have spent their lives learning to name. And beyond the circle of fire and voices, the forest waits in its quiet way, full of old oaks and unseen paths, holding the kind of silence that makes a person believe the world has a memory of its own. You can feel the whole story shift the moment Rome enters it, because Rome did not just arrive with curious questions and a polite interest in local customs. Rome arrived with roads and rules and legions and that very specific imperial confidence that says, "We are about to reorganize your entire world for your own good." The Druids had already been important for centuries by the time a Roman soldier set foot in serious numbers on Celtic soil. They were teachers, judges, ritual leaders, guardians of memory, and the kind of social authority that keeps a culture coherent when everything around it is diverse and tribal and occasionally prepared to settle arguments with a spear. To the Romans, this was fascinating. To Roman generals who wanted obedience rather than philosophical conversation, this was also a problem. A people can be conquered with superior logistics and persistent violence. A worldview is harder to conquer. The Druids were not a single warband to defeat. They were a system of belief and education that could outlast any one battle, and the Romans understood quickly that if you wanted to reshape Celtic society, you needed to weaken the people who helped it remember who it was. The earlier Roman writers who mention the Druids do so with a sense of encountering something old and impressive. By the time Julius Caesar was fighting in Gaul in the middle of the 1st century BCE, he was already dealing with a mature institution. His descriptions are the most famous because he wrote with the confidence of a commander who wanted Rome to see him as both conqueror and keen observer. He tells us that the Druids managed religious life and sacrifices and judged disputes. He says that young men flocked to them for education and that the training was long. He also notes their teaching about the immortality of the soul. It is impossible to read his account without sensing that he was impressed by how deeply rooted their authority was. Caesar was not sentimental. If he took time to describe a social class, it was because that class mattered to the stability of the region he was trying to absorb. His reports suggest that the Druids were almost a parallel government, not in a bureaucratic Roman sense, but in the way they regulated moral order, settled conflicts, and provided a shared religious framework for tribes that might otherwise have had little reason to trust one another. This is where the political danger becomes clear. The Druids were the connective tissue of the Celtic world. To a Roman administrator, a class of tax-exempt spiritual intellectuals who could rally tribes through shared tradition and sacred authority, might look like an obstacle to efficient rule. To a Roman general, they might look like the people who could turn resistance into a spiritual duty. The Romans did not usually crush local religions unless they saw them as direct threats to imperial control. The fact that Druidism began to attract restrictive attention tells us that Rome viewed it as more than colourful folklore. The Druids were likely the kind of influence that could encourage unity across tribal lines, especially in moments of external threat. When you have an invader who speaks in terms of empire and order, the people who speak in terms of ancestral law and sacred obligation become natural leaders of resistance. The clash between Rome and the Druids was not one single event. It was a slow tightening of pressure, a series of campaigns and prohibitions, and a gradual shift in the balance of power. In Gaul, Caesar fought a complex war against a patchwork of tribes who alternated between alliance and rebellion. The Great Uprising under Vercingetorix in 52 BCE became one of the most dramatic episodes of Celtic resistance. It is a story of fortified towns, desperate strategies, scorched earth tactics, and terrifying Roman persistence. The Druids are not the central characters in Caesar's narrative of that rebellion, but the very shape of the uprising suggests the kind of cultural cohesion they helped sustain. The tribes of Gaul did not always get along, yet when the threat became existential, a larger sense of identity emerged. The Druids, as guardians of shared tradition and sacred law, would have been part of the ideological backbone that helped this kind of unity feel legitimate. Even if a Druid did not personally lead a charge, the belief structure they maintained could turn resistance into something that felt not only political, but sacred. Roman accounts of Druidic sacrifice have always carried a grim fascination. The infamous story of the wicker figure, an enormous human-shaped effigy filled with offerings and set ablaze, comes from classical sources that aim to describe the power and severity of Celtic religious practice. The Romans were not above moral storytelling when it suited their needs, but these reports shaped how Druidism was understood for centuries. The image itself is haunting enough to endure, whether you read it as literal practice, symbolic exaggeration, or a Roman attempt to illustrate their enemies as both formidable and in need of civilizing conquest. What matters in the story of empire is that the Romans believed the Druids were capable of commanding life and death in ritual form. That belief alone would have made them seem dangerous. An empire that depends on orderly law and controlled violence is not comfortable with a priesthood that can justify sacrifice through a different moral universe. Britain became the next great stage of confrontation. Caesar made expeditions to Britain in 55 and 54 BCE, and while these were not full conquests, they opened the mental map of Roman ambition. Britain remained outside direct Roman rule until the invasion under Emperor Claudius in 43 CE. By then, the Druids were part of the cultural identity the Romans expected to meet. The Roman conquest of Britain unfolded over decades, and it was as much about cultural integration as it was about military victories. Forts rose, roads spread. Local elites were co-opted into Roman systems, and the Roman style of governance began to reshape daily life. Yet the Druids remained a symbolic and practical center of the old order. They were linked to sacred groves, to the authority of ancestral law, to the notion that the spiritual world was anchored in the land itself, rather than in imperial temples. One of the most dramatic confrontations involved the island of Mona, known today as Anglesey. Roman sources describe it as a stronghold of Druidic power in Britain, a place where the old religion was deeply rooted. The Roman governor Suetonius Paulinus led a campaign against the island around 60 or 61 CE. The descriptions we have are vivid and theatrical. They speak of Druids and their supporters gathering on the shore, invoking curses, raising their arms, and confronting the Roman advance with what must have looked like a dangerous mixture of spiritual confidence and political defiance. The Romans crossed, fought, and destroyed sanctuaries. The sacred groves were burned. The assault was not only punitive, it was strategic. The goal was to break the spiritual infrastructure of resistance. It is difficult not to imagine the emotional impact of this event. For the Celts who revered these places, the destruction of a grove was not simply the loss of a meeting spot. It was an attack on the living map of the sacred world. A grove carries memory. It is where elders taught students, where ritual confirmed communal belonging, where the gods were honored in the presence of their own creation. To see such a place cut down or burned by outsiders would have felt like watching the old universe itself being wounded. The Romans were experts at turning symbolic violence into political results. By targeting sacred centers, they were announcing that Roman authority would now sit above local spiritual sovereignty. The campaign against Anglesey has another dramatic wrinkle, because it was roughly contemporaneous with the uprising led by Boudica, queen of the Iceni. Her rebellion in 60 or 61 CE was explosive and brutal. Roman towns were attacked, including Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium, and the violence on both sides was devastating. The Druids are not always directly tied to Boudica in surviving texts, but the timing makes the whole moment feel like a storm of resistance in which spiritual and political outrage mingled in the same air. It is easy to imagine how a society anchored in sacred tradition might view the rebellion not only as a political necessity, but as a cosmic correction. When empire presses too hard, the gods might demand an answer. A Druidic worldview could give ideological fuel to the kind of uprising that demands more than generic freedom. It demands the restoration of sacred balance. After these conflicts, Roman policy hardened. Emperor Claudius is said to have banned Druidic practices in Gaul, especially those tied to sacrifice. The move makes sense in the Roman legal imagination. You do not just defeat rebellion on the battlefield, you also dismantle its cultural sources. If the Druids were exempt from taxes and military service, if they held pan-tribal authority, if they conducted rituals that reinforced non-Roman identity, then controlling or removing them would have been an obvious step in tightening imperial rule. Rome was pragmatic. It often tolerated local gods, reinterpreted them within Roman frameworks, and allowed regional customs to continue so long as they did not challenge imperial stability. Druidism appears to have crossed the line from tolerated difference into perceived threat. Yet, even as Roman pressure increased, Cultural change was not always a blunt replacement. In many places, older Celtic gods and customs blended with Roman forms. Temples were built where groves may have once held primary authority. Local deities were identified with Roman ones. The religious landscape became layered. In such an environment, one can imagine Druids adapting, retreating into more private roles, or continuing their functions in altered forms. When a priesthood loses public power, it does not necessarily vanish overnight. It may shift into the background, preserved through families, local rituals, and the slow, stubborn persistence of tradition. This part of the story is full of human paradox. The Romans might have seen the Druids as obstacles to order. The local communities likely saw them as guardians of identity. Empires are always good at telling themselves they are bringing peace. Indigenous spiritual authorities are always good at remembering that peace can mean surrender. Between those two perspectives lies the messy truth of cultural contact. Some local elites adopted Roman customs willingly because it brought wealth, stability, and status. Others resisted because the cost was too high. The Druids, whose authority rested in old structures of sacred law and communal tradition, would have been natural symbols of what was at stake. There is also the intriguing possibility that Roman fascination with the Druids indirectly helped preserve their legend. When a conquering power writes about your spiritual class, it ensures that future generations will at least know the name, even if the tradition itself is weakened. Caesar, Tacitus, and other writers did not intend to immortalize Druidism in a romantic sense. They were documenting an enemy system of authority. But history has a habit of turning hostile observations into seeds of fascination. The very fact that the Romans viewed the Druids as powerful enough to suppress suggests that the Druids must have been remarkably influential. It is hard to imagine Rome bothering to ban a harmless sideshow. As the Roman centuries rolled on, the world the Druids had shaped began to change at the foundations. Towns grew under Roman planning. Trade networks intensified. Local leaders became Romanized. Latin seeped into the cultural fabric. The old tribal structures did not disappear entirely, but they were transformed. A spiritual class that once operated as judge, teacher, and counselor to kings would have found its roles challenged by new institutions. Roman courts, Roman tax systems, Roman military obligations, and Roman civic religion all altered the functioning of society. The Druids, who had been the interpreters of law and the keepers of sacred legitimacy, were now living in a world where legitimacy could be granted by imperial appointment and law could be codified in Roman terms. Yet the older sacred sense of place likely lingered. Even in Roman Britain, the land itself remained Celtic in spirit. A river that had been revered for centuries would not suddenly stop feeling sacred because a Roman fort was built nearby. A hill that carried ancestral meaning would still loom in the imagination even if a Roman road ran past it. The Druids may have diminished as a formal institution, but the ideas they nurtured could persist in folk practice. Reverence for springs, trees, and certain landscapes would have survived as local customs. The sense that the other world was close in certain places would have remained part of how people experienced their environment. This is why the Roman period feels like a turning rather than a simple ending. The Druids were caught between two immense forces. On one side was an ancient religious and cultural system that had grown organically over generations. On the other side was the administrative machinery of an empire that believed it could rationalize the world into something legible and profitable. The conflict was not just military, it was philosophical. The Druids represented a worldview where knowledge was held in memory, sacred authority anchored in nature, and law intertwined with ritual. Rome represented a worldview where power was centralized, law codified, and religious practice increasingly tied to civic structures and later to imperial ideology. For the individual Druid living through these changes, the experience must have been layered with personal grief and adaptation. Imagine a teacher whose student enrollment begins to shrink because young nobles are now fascinated by Roman education. Imagine a judge whose authority is quietly undercut by the presence of Roman legal officials. Imagine a ritual leader whose sacred grove is now watched with suspicion. None of this would be dramatic in a single day. It would be the slow experience of watching your world shrink by a few inches at a time. And yet, even with suppression, there is a stubborn dignity to the idea that Druidism could not be erased instantly. Rome was powerful, but the human attachment to ancestral knowledge is stronger than edicts. The Druidic presence may have retreated into the shadows of local life, maintained in remote places, protected by communities, reluctant to let go of old ways. When later generations in Ireland and Wales remembered Druids as wise figures and prophets, they were working with echoes of a tradition that had already survived centuries of pressure. As evening settles over this stretch of history, the image that comes to mind is not a battlefield, but a small gathering in a place that feels slightly hidden. A grove that escaped the worst of Roman attention. A teacher repeating sacred law to a handful of students who still believe the old world is worth carrying forward. A community that still lights seasonal fires, still honors the turning of the year, still treats the land as a living presence, even while Roman structures tower nearby. The empire may control roads and taxation, but it cannot easily control the private ways people interpret storms, blessings, dreams, and the quiet meaning of an oak tree that has stood longer than any emperor's reign. The Roman world, for all its power, was never permanent. The Druids knew something about cycles. They lived in a universe that turned, and though the institutions that supported them were being weakened by force and policy, the deeper ideas of sacred time and sacred land could not be marched away like prisoners. They settled into memory, folklore, and small acts of continuity that are almost invisible to conquerors. Night spreads across the countryside of Roman Britain and Gaul. Soldiers settle in their forts, merchants count coin by lamplight, local elites practice Roman manners at dinner tables. Somewhere beyond the edges of official life, the old language of trees and seasons is still spoken quietly. The Druids, once public architects of meaning, now inhabit a narrower space, but the world they helped shape has not vanished. It has only learned to survive in softer voices. After Rome, the Druids do not disappear with a dramatic curtain drop. They fade in the way old constellations fade when a brighter city grows around you. You still know the stars are there, but the sky has changed. The Roman departure from Britain in the early 5th century did not bring the old world neatly back to life. It brought uncertainty, shifting power, and a new patchwork of kingdoms trying to define themselves. In Gaul, Roman influence remained longer and blended into new political forms. In Ireland, which never became a formal Roman province, the older Celtic structures continued with more continuity. But even there, the winds of change were already moving. This is the part of the story where the Druids stop being a public institution that outsiders can easily point at and start becoming something more complicated. They become memory, rumour, local authority, and literary shadow. They become the kind of figure people remember in stories even when the original job description has quietly changed. The rising force that reshaped this world more deeply than any single army was Christianity. It arrived over time, through missionaries, through trade networks, through political alliances, and through the natural human hunger for a new kind of meaning when an old order is under stress. The easiest mistake is to imagine a clean showdown between Christian saints and pagan Druids, as if history were a stage play with two actors and one decisive duel. The reality was almost certainly more gradual and locally varied. Conversion does not happen all at once. It happens household by household, king by king, village by village. Sometimes it is embraced with enthusiasm. Sometimes it is accepted because it brings diplomatic advantages. Sometimes it is tolerated at first and then slowly becomes dominant. The Druids would have lived through this as a long season of cultural weather. In the earlier centuries, a Druid might have been the most educated person in the region, the one who could arbitrate disputes, preserve genealogy, and sanctify a ruler's legitimacy. But as Christian clergy and monastic communities spread, they brought a different kind of learned authority. Monasteries became centers of education, literacy, artistry, and record-keeping. The Christian priest and the Druid occupied overlapping territory in the social imagination. Both could be counselors. Both could interpret the mysteries of life and death. Both could speak with the aura of sacred knowledge, and both could serve as the moral backbone of a community. When two roles overlap, history tends not to remove one instantly. It tends to reshape the older role until it fits the new world or until it slips into legend. In Ireland especially, this overlap created a fascinating transformation. The later Irish literary tradition, preserved by Christian scribes, still remembers Druids as powerful figures in a heroic age. They appear as advisors to kings, masters of prophecy, and guardians of ritual law. The very fact that they appear in these texts suggests that the memory of their prestige remains sharp. Yet these texts also show a changing landscape. Druids in these stories sometimes feel like rivals to Christian saints, sometimes like wise men operating in a world that is already shifting beneath their feet. A famous pattern, repeated in various legends, is the contest of miracles and signs. A saint arrives. A Druid challenges him. The saint's power proves stronger. The Druid's authority collapses or converts. Even if these scenes are literary dramatizations rather than eyewitness history, they reveal something important about cultural identity. The older world was not simply rejected, it was restaged in narrative form, so the new world could explain why it deserved to win. This is where the story becomes tender as well as dramatic. There are hints that the learned class of the older Celtic world did not vanish so much as evolve. The Fillid, the professional poets and scholars of medieval Ireland, carried many functions that looked like descendants of Druidic education. They preserved history, genealogy, law, and story. They were deeply trained in poetic forms and memory. They advised kings and held moral authority through their words. It is entirely plausible that as formal Druidic religious power declined, a portion of that intellectual tradition was absorbed into the bardic and legal classes that continued under Christian rule. A culture does not easily abandon its respect for learning, it simply shifts the institutions that house it. Even the spiritual relationship with nature did not vanish. Christianity in the Celtic world developed its own locally flavored reverence for landscapes, wells, islands, and sacred places. Many ancient springs and wells that may have once carried pagan significance became associated with saints. The old sense that certain places were alive with power could be reinterpreted rather than erased. A sacred grove might lose its official ritual centrality, but the emotional logic of sacred space could survive in the devotion people felt to a holy well or an island monastery. In that sense, the Druids' worldview left fingerprints on the new religious landscape. The language changed, the theology changed, but the human habit of experiencing certain places as special remained. When you consider this kind of continuity, the classic dramatic image of Saint Patrick confronting the Druids begins to feel less like a strict historical record and more like a cultural symbol. The stories of Patrick and the conversion of Irish kings often present Druids as the established spiritual authorities who must be outshined by the new faith. There are tales of fires lit in defiance of royal or Druidic taboo, of prophetic contests, of kings forced to choose between old and new sacred orders. Whether or not these events happened exactly as described, they show the psychological shape of conversion. The new religion needed a narrative of legitimacy. To achieve that, it had to depict the old authority as real and strong enough to be worth defeating. This narrative style is not unique to Ireland. In Wales and Britain more broadly, the memory of ancient sacred specialists lingered into the medieval imagination. The figure of the prophet, the wild seer, the man of the woods who is both cursed and blessed with knowledge, begins to fill the space that might once have been more formally occupied by Druids. This is one reason the later legends surrounding Merlin feel so interesting in this context. The Welsh figure, Myrddin, a prophet who in some traditions goes mad with grief and lives in the wilderness, is not literally a druid in historical terms. But the cultural role he plays has a familiar shape. He is a bridge figure, preserving the idea that the land still produces people who can see beyond ordinary reality, people whose authority comes from communion with forces older than courts and churches. The other great shift is the rise of written tradition. The Druids famously favored oral transmission of sacred knowledge. Christianity, by contrast, was deeply tied to texts. Scripture, commentary, and liturgy all reinforced the authority of the written word. The growth of literacy and manuscript culture gradually changed how communities stored memory. When law and history can be written, the social need for a single class of memory keepers weakens. This does not mean oral tradition died, far from it. But the balance of cultural power begins to tilt. The Druidic ideal of secret knowledge held in disciplined memory is replaced by a Christian ideal that knowledge can be preserved, standardized, and spread through writing. To a community adapting to new realities, this would have seemed both liberating and unsettling. A written record offers stability. It also reduces the exclusive aura of those who once guarded knowledge by voice alone. In Gaul, where Romanization had already reshaped society, the decline of Druids likely accelerated earlier. Roman law, urbanization, and the spread of imperial religious norms diminished the institutional space Druids needed to operate publicly. By the time Christianity became the dominant religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century, the old Druidic structures in Gaul had likely already been hollowed out. What remained might have been localized forms of nature, reverence, and folk practice, rather than a continent-wide priestly class. The Druids in Gaul became part of the long memory of a conquered world. Britain's story is more jagged. After the Roman withdrawal, Britain did not snap back into an old Celtic unity. The island became a mosaic of competing powers. The arrival and expansion of Germanic groups, the formation of new kingdoms, and the continued presence of Celtic-speaking populations in the West created a complicated cultural scene. In such a world, the old Druidic institution had little chance of reasserting itself in the way it might have before Rome. The political and demographic map had changed too much. Yet the sense of the other world, the old stories of sacred landscape, and the endurance of mythic motifs continued in the folklore that would eventually filter into medieval literature. This is also the period in which the Druids begin to shift from real social authorities into literary characters. Once a role is no longer fully current, it becomes available for storytelling. A Druid can become a symbol of ancient wisdom, a keeper of forbidden knowledge, or a dangerous rival to the new order. This is one reason that medieval texts sometimes portray Druids with the dramatic flair of sorcerers. The older religious authority is recast as a kind of magical opposition. The new order defines itself not only by what it is, but by what it is replacing. When a scribe writes about a druid summoning storms or casting prophecy, the text may be echoing older beliefs while also framing them in a moral world that has shifted. One of the most striking quiet changes in this era is the way law itself transforms. The Druids had been associated with arbitration and sacred legal authority. Medieval Irish society still retained complex native legal traditions, often called Brehon law, which continued well into Christian times. The legal experts of that system were not Druids by name, but the structure of learned legal authority, memorized rulings, and deep respect for precedent feels like an echo of an older educational culture. Societies do not invent complex legal memory out of nowhere. They build it over generations. The Druidic legacy may have left a trace in the way legal learning was valued and transmitted. The emotional experience of this transition must have been layered with ambiguity. Imagine an elder, trained in the old ways, watching a new faith arrive, not as a violent invader, but as a persuasive alternative. The new religion offers a universal story, a moral framework that promises salvation beyond tribal boundaries, and a literate tradition that can travel with unusual speed. For some, it would have felt like a threat. For others, it might have felt like an expansion of the sacred world rather than a replacement. The human mind is capable of holding more than one framework during periods of change. It is entirely plausible that for a time, people honored the old festivals culturally while adopting Christian practices spiritually, or that they accepted Christian rites while privately preserving older reverence for certain places and seasonal rhythms. This gradual blending is part of why the Druids remain such an evocative presence in later memory. They are not only remembered as a religious class, they are remembered as a symbol of an older relationship to the world. A relationship where knowledge was anchored in land, where the sacred lived in trees and rivers, and where the voice of tradition could shape political legitimacy. When that worldview receded, it left behind a cultural longing. The medieval imagination could look back on the Druids and see them as representatives of a time when the land itself seemed more enchanted. And then there is the curious persistence of Druid, like figures in local myth. Even as formal Druidic identity faded, the archetype of the wise nature seer remained useful in story. The advisor who knows the old laws. The prophet who can interpret omens. The healer who understands the secret language of plants. These figures did not require the institutional title of Druid to exist. They could be rebranded into the narrative machinery of a Christian society. In some tales, the old wise man becomes a hermit saint. In others, he becomes a mysterious magician of the wild. The functions remain recognizable even as the cultural labels change. The more you look at this period, the more you see that the Druids were not erased so much as redistributed into different cultural containers. The formal priesthood declined. The intellectual respect for memory and law continued. The reverence for sacred places evolved. The symbolic figure of the nature-wise counselor remained alive in story. That is an astonishing level of cultural resilience. It suggests that what the Druids represented was not dependent only on ritual practice. It was also dependent on a deeper Celtic habit of thought, a habit that valued a world where the sacred and practical were interwoven. As centuries passed, the word Druid itself became increasingly detached from living practice. By the early medieval period, the Druids were more often remembered than encountered. They became inhabitants of a legendary past, but the fascination did not fade. If anything, it intensified, because distance can romanticize what closeness might treat as routine. A living Druid might have been a stern legal authority and a demanding teacher. A remembered Druid can be a figure of mythic depth, the person who knew the secrets of the forest and the movement of stars. This is the point where the story begins to feel like a long twilight. The old world is not dead in a single blow. It is simply no longer the official daylight. The new religious and political order defines itself through different symbols. Yet under the surface, the older patterns continue to pulse. The seasonal logic of Celtic festivals echoes through rural life. The love of genealogy and heroic memory persists in poetry. The sacred landscape remains sacred in feeling, even when the language used to describe it is Christian. If you were to walk through Ireland in the early centuries of Christian expansion, you might still sense how close the two worlds were. A monastic scribe copies a gospel by candlelight, but outside the monastery walls, the land still speaks with the old voice of hills and wells and trees. A king supports a church, but still listens with pride to poets who can recite the lineage that binds him to ancient heroes. A community gathers for a Christian feast day, but the timing of agricultural life and communal celebration still follows the deep rhythm of the year that the Druids once helped sanctify. The old architecture of meaning has not vanished. It has been renovated. There is also a quiet irony here. The Christian scribes who preserved so much of the heroic Celtic literature ensured that the Druids would not be forgotten. The very people representing the new order became the archivists of the old memory. They recorded stories of the Tuatha De Danann, of heroic cycles, of kings and battles and prophecies, and in doing so, they kept alive the cultural space where Druids could still appear as powerful figures of the past. This preservation was not always neutral. Christian writers sometimes framed older pagan elements through their own moral lens, but the survival of the stories at all is a gift. Without them, the Druids would be even more shadowy than they already are. So the story of Druids in the Christian age is not only about decline, it is about transformation. It is about how a cultural role can dissolve into multiple successors. It is about how a society can change its official faith while still carrying emotional loyalty to older symbols. It is about how the memory of a sacred class can become a mythic resource for later generations. As the day lengthens into evening on this part of the journey, the image that stays with me is a simple one. A rural path winding between fields toward a cluster of trees that older people still treat with special respect. A new wooden cross stands not far away, perhaps placed there not to erase the sacredness of the place, but to reinterpret it. Children grow up hearing both the names of saints and the old stories of heroes. The language of faith shifts, but the landscape remains the same faithful witness it has always been. Somewhere in that landscape, the last of the traditional Druids may have lived out their lives not as public masters of society, but as quiet elders whose knowledge was gradually absorbed into the memory of families and local poets. Their world was narrowing, but it was not meaningless. A culture does not forget its teachers completely. It simply learns to carry them differently. There is a strange kind of immortality that belongs to certain ideas. You can outlaw them, you can starve them of institutions, you can remove the people who once carried them as a professional calling, and yet the idea stays floating in the cultural air, like pollen that refuses to settle. The Druids are a perfect example of that. After centuries of Roman suppression, after the long Christian transformation of the Celtic world, after the slow fading of the old priestly class into memory and legend, you might expect the word druid to become a historical footnote. Instead, it becomes a magnet. It attracts poets, antiquarians, romantics, spiritual seekers, and the kind of enthusiastic amateur historian who looks at a standing stone and feels personally certain that someone important once stood right there with very strong opinions about the solstice. What happened to the Druids in the modern world is not a simple revival of an old religion in a pure form. It is something more like a cultural resurrection, built from fragments of history, a lot of imagination, and a persistent human desire to believe that the ancient world left us not only ruins, but unfinished conversations. The first big wave of this renewed fascination arrived with the thinkers of the early modern period and then grew into a full blaze during the 18th and 19th centuries. This was the age of antiquarian curiosity, when educated Europeans began to treat the distant past as something that could be reconstructed and celebrated rather than simply dismissed as barbaric. It was also the age of Romanticism, which had a special love for wild landscapes, ancient roots, and the idea that modern life had traded soul for convenience. The Druids fit neatly into that mood. They were associated with forests and sacred groves. They were linked in classical texts with philosophy and cosmic knowledge, and they carried the glamour of a lost elite that seemed to belong to a world more emotionally connected to nature. If you were a poet gazing at a stormy hillside in Wales or the misty glens of Scotland, the Druids were not just historical figures. They were emotional proof that the land itself had once been governed by sacred intelligence. This is also the period when Stonehenge and other megalithic sites were pulled into the Druid story in a dramatic way. Today we understand that Stonehenge predates the historical Druids by a long stretch of time. But that did not stop earlier scholars from making the connection with confidence. In the 18th century, figures like William Stukely argued for Druidic links to Stonehenge, and these ideas were persuasive in their era because they offered a tidy narrative. You had a mysterious monument. You had a mysterious priesthood. Put them together and you get a story that feels satisfying, even if the actual timeline is more complicated. This belief did something important to the public imagination. It anchored the Druids to physical landmarks that people could visit. Once you can stand in a circle of stones and imagine robed figures chanting in the dawn light, the Druids stop being abstract. They become a presence you can almost feel in the air. The Romantic Revival also had a slightly mischievous side, because not everyone who contributed to the modern Druid image was strictly committed to historical accuracy. In Wales, Iolo Morganwg became famous for creating and promoting texts and ceremonies that he presented as ancient, even though many were partially invented or heavily reworked. He helped shape a modern sense of bardic and druidic tradition that influenced cultural festivals and national identity. What is fascinating here is not the argument about authenticity, but the cultural appetite that made these creations so influential. People wanted the Druids back. They wanted a lineage of native wisdom that could stand proudly beside Greek philosophers and Roman emperors. In the growing story of national cultures, the Druids were recruited as dignified ancestors, the kind who could give a modern people a deep spiritual pedigree. From these romantic roots grew more formal organizations that used the Druid name. Some of these orders were fraternal or social rather than purely religious, resembling the broader tradition of societies that combined ritual, symbolism, and community values. The Druids became part of a cultural movement that valued heritage and moral ideals, sometimes more than precise reconstruction of Iron Age practice. This is one of the charming paradoxes of the modern Druid story. The more the historical Druids remained elusive, the more flexible the name became. It could serve as a banner for philosophy, for nationalism, for nature reverence, or for a sense of inward spiritual adventure. The Druids had become a symbol large enough to hold many meanings. By the 20th century and into the present, modern Druidry developed more explicitly as a spiritual path for some people, often within broader contemporary pagan movements. Groups such as the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids helped shape a modern practice that draws inspiration from Celtic mythology, seasonal festivals, ritual creativity, and a deep respect for the natural world. These modern traditions do not claim to be a perfect replica of Iron Age priesthood. Instead, they often present themselves as a living spiritual art rooted in old stories and modern needs. The festivals of the old Celtic year, especially Samhain, Imbolc, Beltane, and Lugnasad, remain central to many who identify with Druid-inspired practice. The turning of the seasons is treated not as a quaint historical theme, but as a sacred rhythm still worth honouring. In this modern landscape, the Druids also become something like ambassadors for ecological spirituality. This is not a small thing. The idea of the Druid as a friend of forests and keeper of earth wisdom resonates deeply with people living in an era of environmental crisis and urban disconnection. Even if the historical Druids were not environmentalists in the modern political sense, the broader image of a sacred relationship with land and life offers a powerful alternative to the feeling that nature is just a resource bank. For many modern practitioners and admirers, Druidry is less about reenacting ancient rites and more about restoring a kind of attentiveness. Listening to the seasons, learning the names of trees, treating rivers and hills as more than scenery, making spiritual meaning out of everyday encounters with a living world that still feels mysteriously intelligent if you slow down long enough. The cultural reach of the Druids also expanded through literature, art, and eventually mass media. The 19th and early 20th centuries loved the Druid as a dramatic figure in novels, poems, and historical fantasies. Later, fantasy literature and role-playing games cemented the Druid as a recognizable archetype, often portrayed as a nature mage, shapeshifter, or healer allied with animals and elemental forces. This version of the Druid is not a careful historical portrait, but it keeps alive the emotional truth of the Druid image. The Druid belongs to the forest. The Druid knows secrets. The Druid stands in a world where nature responds to human reverence. These ideas are powerful enough to survive translation into fictional forms because they satisfy a deep cultural appetite for enchanted landscapes and wise guardians of the wild. There is also a public ritual dimension that continues to capture attention. Gatherings at sites like Stonehenge during solstices show how modern people still crave the experience of sacred time and sacred place. You can view these events as cultural festivals, spiritual ceremonies, or theatrical declarations of identity, depending on your perspective. The important point for the story of the Druids is that the name and the image still pull people into collective acts of meaning. A visitor might arrive skeptical and leave quietly moved. Another might arrive already devoted and feel connected to a chain of ancestry that is more emotional than genealogical. Either way, the Druids function as a gateway into the idea that ancient time is not fully dead, that it can still be touched through ritual and imagination. What makes the modern Druid revival so interesting is that it is not a simple story of recovery. It is a story of invention as continuity. The historical Druids left no texts of their own. The surviving accounts were written by outsiders. The medieval stories that mention Druids were preserved through Christian lenses. So, modern Druidry has had to build itself with humility and creativity, pulling from archaeology, folklore, classical sources, and a wide range of Celtic mythic material. This is not a flaw in the tradition. It is part of its character. Modern Druidry often embraces the idea that living traditions grow, adapt, and respond to the needs of the present. In that sense, the modern Druids are not claiming to be museum exhibits. They are claiming to be participants in an ongoing relationship with nature and story. The real historical benefit of this whole revival may be broader than any single spiritual identity. The Druids have helped keep public interest in Celtic history and mythology alive. They have inspired people to learn about Iron Age Europe, to explore Irish and Welsh literature, to pay attention to cultural continuity and change, and to think about how societies store meaning. They have also offered a way for people to connect with heritage in a world where identity can feel fluid and dislocated. For someone who feels the pull of Celtic roots, the Druids can function as an ancestral symbol of wisdom and dignity. For someone with no genealogical connection at all, the Druids can still function as a universal reminder that humans once lived with a different sense of relationship to the land. There is a quiet comedy to this as well, in a gentle Bill Bryson kind of way. The original Druids would probably be surprised to learn that their name now appears on bookstore shelves next to meditation guides, fantasy novels, and friendly manuals on how to celebrate a modern seasonal ceremony in your backyard. They might be even more surprised to learn that their identity has been attached to monuments built long before their time. But cultural memory is not a legal court. It does not require perfect evidence to produce a powerful story. It requires emotional usefulness. The Druids have remained useful because they represent a kind of human longing that never really goes away. The longing for wise teachers, the longing for a sacred landscape, the longing for a world where knowledge and nature belong to the same sentence. And in the end, that might be the most important thread tying the ancient Druids to their modern heirs in imagination. Both are rooted in the idea that the world is not silent, that the seasons are not just mechanical, that a tree can be more than wood, that a river can be more than a line on a map, that wisdom can be drawn from how life behaves, rather than only from what books say. In a modern world that can feel relentlessly engineered, the Druid image gives people permission to experience wonder without apology. So if you stepped into a modern Druid gathering today, in a grove or a field, or a quiet community hall decorated with symbols of the year's turning, you would not be seeing a perfect reconstruction of Iron Age priesthood. You would be seeing the afterlife of an idea. You would be seeing how cultural memory takes what is fragmentary and turns it into a living practice. You might hear poetry and song. You might see ritual shaped around fire or water, around the sun's shifting path, or the promise of spring returning. You might find people who are there for spirituality, for community, for heritage, or simply for the comfort of belonging to a story larger than themselves. And you might feel that the Druids have now become what so many ancient figures eventually become in the long arc of history. They have become a bridge, not only between past and present, but between the human need for meaning and the enduring presence of the natural world. The night air feels different in this modern part of the story. The forests are smaller in many places. The cities are louder. The sky is brighter at night than our ancestors would ever have believed possible. And yet, the same old human impulse remains: to gather, to honor the turning year, to find sacredness in living things, to imagine that the ancient world still has something to teach us if we listen carefully enough.